plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the free pizza, good tips, and a lot of driving around town. I had taken the job to save up for college, and most nights were uneventful. However, there was one delivery I would never forget, a night that still haunts me to this day. It was a stormy Friday night, and I was about to clock out when Tony, the owner, handed me one last delivery. The address was unfamiliar, located on the outskirts of town near an old abandoned industrial area. I hesitated, but Tony assured me it was legit, a big order with a generous tip promised. I grabbed the pizzas, checked the address one more time, and headed out into the pouring rain. The roads were slick, and the visibility was poor. My GPS led me down winding roads that grew increasingly narrow and desolate. Finally, I reached the destination, an old, dilapidated mansion standing ominously at the end of a long gravel driveway. The mansion looked like something out of a horror movie. Its windows were dark, and the whole place seemed to lean slightly, as if tired from years of standing against the elements. I parked my car and, with some reluctance, grabbed the pizza bags and made my way to the front door. The porch creaked under my weight, and I hesitated before knocking on the heavy wooden door. My knock echoed through the house, and I waited, glancing around uneasily. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a pale complexion. "Good evening," he said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "You have our pizzas?" Yes," I replied, forcing a smile. "That'll be $37.50. He reached into his pocket and handed me exact change, plus a generous tip. "Please, come inside while I check the order." I didn't want to go in, but the rain was coming down harder, and the man seemed harmless, if a bit strange. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud thud. The interior of the mansion was just as eerie as the outside, dimly lit with flickering candles and filled with old, dusty furniture covered in white sheets. "Follow me," the man said, leading me down a long hallway. The air was thick and musty, and I could hear the faint sound of classical music playing somewhere in the house. We entered a large, dimly lit dining room where a long table was set with fine china and silverware, but covered in dust as if it hadn't been used in years. The man began to check the pizzas, lifting the lids and inspecting each one carefully. As he did, I noticed portraits on the walls, faded, sepia-toned photographs of stern-looking people, all with the same piercing eyes as the man in front of me. A chill ran down my spine. "Everything looks perfect," he finally said, closing the last box. "Thank you." I nodded and turned to leave, eager to get back to the safety of my car. But as I reached the door, I heard a whisper, a soft, unintelligible murmur coming from the shadows. I froze, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like many voices speaking all at once. "Is there someone else here?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man smiled, a cold, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just the spirits of the house. They get restless sometimes." I laughed nervously, hoping he was joking. "Right, well, have a good night." I practically ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the front door, I glanced back and saw shadows moving along the walls, darting and shifting as if alive. I yanked the door open and dashed outside, the rain hitting my face like needles. I jumped into my car and started the engine, glancing back at the mansion. The man was standing in the doorway, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I sped down the gravel driveway, the tires skidding on the wet ground. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't slow down until I was back in town, the familiar lights of the city bringing a sense of normalcy. I pulled into the pizzeria's parking lot and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The mansion, the strange man, the whispering voices, it all felt like a bad dream. I went inside and told Tony about the delivery. He listened with a frown, then said, "That address doesn't sound familiar. Are you sure you got the right place?" I showed him the slip, and his face paled. "This can't be right. That area was abandoned years ago. No one lives there." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't argue. I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I quit my job at Club Pizzeria the next day, leaving the memories of that eerie mansion behind. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispering voices, and I wonder if the spirits of that old house still remember me. Working the night shift at the office was usually quiet and uneventful. Most people hated the idea of being in an empty building late at night, but I enjoyed the peace and quiet. I could focus on my tasks without any interruptions. The office, located in an old building in the city center, had a certain charm with its vintage decor and large windows that overlooked the streets below. One night, I found myself alone in the office. My colleagues had left early, leaving me with a stack of work to complete. Midnight approached, and the building was eerily silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The dim lighting cast long shadows, giving the room an unsettling atmosphere. As I was typing away at my computer, I heard a faint noise behind me. It sounded like a whisper, too soft to make out any words. I dismissed it as my imagination and continued working. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time a bit louder. I stopped typing and listened carefully, but the noise had ceased. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to take a break. I got up from my desk and walked to the small kitchenette to make a cup of coffee. As I poured the water into the coffee maker, I heard a loud thud from the office. I rushed back, expecting to find something had fallen off a desk. To my surprise, everything was in its place. The chairs were neatly tucked under the desks, and the papers were still stacked in orderly piles. Shaking my head, I returned to my desk, trying to convince myself that I was just tired and hearing things. But as the minutes ticked by, the strange noises continued. A soft tapping on the walls, a faint rustling sound, and the unmistakable creak of a chair moving on its own. My heart started to race, and I glanced around the office nervously. Suddenly, the office chair at the desk opposite mine began to move. It rolled slowly away from the desk, then stopped abruptly. I stared in disbelief, my hands gripping the edge of my desk. Before I could react, the chair lifted off the ground and hovered in the air. I watched, frozen in fear, as it flew across the room and crashed into the wall with a deafening bang. Panic set in, and I jumped to my feet, ready to run. But before I could take a step, other objects in the office started to move. Papers flew off the desks, swirling around like a tornado. The computer monitors flickered, and one by one they turned off, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the moon outside, casting an eerie glow through the windows. I felt a cold breeze sending shivers down my spine. It felt like something was in the room with me, something unseen and malevolent. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around, trying to spot the source of the disturbance. As I reached the door, I felt a force push me, sending me stumbling backward. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. The lights flickered above me, and I heard the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. It felt as though something was chasing me, getting closer with each step. Finally, I reached the elevator and slammed my hand on the button. The doors opened, and I rushed inside, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor. The elevator doors closed slowly, and as they did, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall and indistinct, but its presence filled me with dread. The elevator descended, and I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. When the doors opened, I ran out of the building and into the safety of the brightly lit street. I never looked back. The next day, I told my boss what had happened, but he dismissed my story as a product of an overactive imagination and too much caffeine. My colleagues laughed it off, saying I had probably fallen asleep and had a nightmare. But I knew what I had experienced was real. I never worked the night shift alone again. The memory of that night haunted me, and I could never shake the feeling that something sinister lurked in the shadows of that old office building. To this day, I wonder what it was that I encountered and whether it still roams the halls at midnight, waiting for its next victim.